few things in my presentation today that are a little controversial, so I just want to ask, nobody punch me in the face, okay? No. Now, I want to thank Jan for the kind introduction. I want to thank Jan and Itzik for convening this conference and inviting me to get together with friends and colleagues, and it's great to be seeing people whose work I admire and people whose opinion I respect in the same room after 2 years. I want to thank Jonathan Kaplan, no relation, for allowing us to convene in University of Texas. This has just been a wonderful, really great opportunity. And I think that obviously Sherry and Agi and I were working independent of one another, but it is in the serendipitous genius of the conference that I think you're going to hear a lot of resonances in our work, even though, of course, you know, my opinions are my own. So with that in mind, the perimeters of Bashevis's engagement with the United States were already set in 1943. In August of that year, Bashevis defined the predicament of Yiddish writers in the United States in negative terms when he characterized the Polish Yiddish literary culture that had, of course, nurtured his genius, and which by then was known by all Yiddish speakers to be in the process of being annihilated by writing, quote, "A contradiction ran through this literature's entire existence. As given Göttlich on a Gott, Weltlich on a Welt, it was godly without a God, worldly without a world. For the Yiddish writer who comes from there," Bashevis concludes, "the very ground from which he derived literary sustenance has been destroyed along with Jewish Poland. His characters are dead. Their language has been silenced. All that he has to draw from are memories," end quote. For Bashevis's readers, the brutality of his characterization was apparent. From the hindsight of nearly 80 years, we can appreciate the pain that motivates Bashevis's condemnation of secular Yiddish culture. His anger and contempt, I would contend, mask a survivor's guilt. But as a literary program, these words confine Bashevis's writing deliberately, consciously, to a spectral past. The dismissal and impossibility which Bashevis seemed to condemn the prospects of a Yiddish culture in the United States receive its confirmation in an essay that appeared from the same period on Yiddish literature in America, the argument of which obligated the editors of the journal in which it appeared to dissociate themselves from its conclusions. Bashevis writes there, quote, "The Yiddish language developed in and around the Jewish home, the synagogue, the shop, and the artisan's workhouse. The sum of its objects and ideas remained very limited. In general, it can be said that however poor the Yiddish lexicon was on the other side of the Atlantic, here its impoverishment has become even greater. It sounds almost laughable when someone writes, "Wenn Binim hat sich umgekehrt mit der Prom von Staten Island, hat ihm Pesse Breine der Lang a Wetschere von Schöpsene Koteletten mit zerribbene Kartoffel mit Arbescheuten, beschmolzen mit Brotjoich." The Yiddish words and even the names so familiar to us grate in our ears here. A belletrist is the first to perceive the false tone they have acquired, translating English words like lamb chops, mashed potatoes, string beans, gravy, and Staten Island ferry into their literal Yiddish equivalents, robs the sentence of all its local color and so confuses the description, end quote. And so the matter would appear to stand. The Yiddish writer in America is unable to write about America because the contrast between what Bashevis characterizes as the local traditional character of the Yiddish language and the modernity and opulence of American life deprives the author of a literary language appropriate to his subject matter. Yiddish literature for Bashevis is therefore left in a no man's land between an irretrievable murdered past and a future that offers no home for the language or its speakers. The only available subject matter for the Yiddish writer, and apparently the only audience to receive his words, are ghosts. And the author himself is therefore relegated to a kind of undead status, a person alive only through an accident of history, an image, as he writes, from years ago, present somewhere in the fourth dimension, end quote. Although Bashevis does eventually come to incorporate scenes of the United States, a nation that for him seems to have consisted exclusively of New York City and Miami Beach, I would contend that his attitude toward the United States remains fatalistically yet instructively unchanged over the subsequent 4 decades of his career. The American experience, in all of its complexity, remains fundamentally unexamined in his writing, and an American audience remains fundamentally unaddressed in his ferocious dismissal of their homeland. Yet in writing about Holocaust survivors, who as much as refugee authors of Yiddish literature such as himself are accidents of history, Bashevis is among the first writers to introduce the theme of the Holocaust to Jewish American literature, and subsequent English language authors who have approached the theme, such as Saul Bellow, Cynthia Ozick, or Philip Roth, appear to be following his lead in writing about the Holocaust and specifically about Holocaust survivors. In particular, the Cafeteria, which he published in 1968, perhaps coincidentally in the same Yiddish journal where 25 years earlier he had pronounced the Yiddish literature of Poland to be a dead letter, ranks among the very finest of his narratives ever. It describes the brief and intense relationship of a successful Yiddish writer with Esther, an emotionally fragile woman who spent World War II in a Russian gulag. The emotional climax of the story occurs when the woman claims to the narrator that late one night she saw Hitler addressing what appears to be a Ku Klux Klan rally taking place at the Jewish cafeteria on Broadway where she and the writer had met. To translate the experience of the Holocaust into American literature, Bashevis employs a strategy of indirection. Neither the narrator nor the female protagonist, Esther, are Holocaust survivors in the sense of people who lived in the Nazi ghettos or in the death camps. The Holocaust nonetheless casts a shadow over their individual lives, their relationship, and the city where they reside. To set the stage for this relationship, and to create a setting in which the use of Yiddish can be dramatically plausible, Bashevis describes the Upper West Side neighborhood in which he lives as a kind of a shtetl. Quote, "I have been moving around in this neighborhood for over 30 years, as long as I lived in Poland. I know each block, each house. There has been little building here on Uptown Broadway in the last decades, and I have the illusion of having put down roots here. I have spoken in most of the synagogues. They know me in some of the stores and in the vegetarian restaurants. Women with whom I have had affairs live on the side streets. Even the pigeons know me. The moment I come out of the side streets, they begin to fly toward me from blocks away." End quote. Now, if the area from 96th Street to 72nd Street and from Central Park to Riverside Drive can be likened to a kind of a shtetl, and any of us who have lived on the Upper West Side can certainly appreciate that it is, in fact, a kind of a shtetl, it makes it all the easier, nonetheless, for the author later in the story to superimpose the imagery of the Holocaust onto American life. Then the Jewish cafeteria becomes the American equivalent of the Beis Medrash, the house of study, the traditional meeting place in the shtetl for unattached men. Quote, "The cafeteria people I meet here are mostly men, old bachelors like myself, would-be writers, retired teachers, some with dubious doctorate titles, a rabbi without a congregation, a painter of Jewish themes, a few translators, all of them immigrants from Poland or from Russia," end quote. Having established the Upper West Side as a transformed shtetl, it becomes apparent that even though the Holocaust did not, in fact, take place in New York City, this metropolis will manifest the aftershocks of World War II. Bashevis writes, "I have played with the idea that all of humanity suffers from schizophrenia. Along with the atom, the personality of Homo sapiens has been splitting. When it comes to technology, the brain still functions, but in everything else, degeneration has begun. They are all insane. The communists, the fascists, the preachers of democracy, the writers, the painters, the clergies, the atheists. Soon, technology too will disintegrate. Buildings will collapse. Power plants will stop generating electricity. Generals will drop atomic bombs on their own populations. Mad revolutionaries will run in the street, crying fantastic slogans. I have thought it would begin in New York. This metropolis has all the symptoms of a mind gone berserk. Although this strategy of superimposition serves to integrate New York City into a geography and a typology where Bashevis can recognize Yiddish culture as functional and dramatically plausible, the interruption or supersession of contemporary American culture with Yiddish civilization and its destruction have genuinely problematic implications for both the way in which the Holocaust has been portrayed in American culture and in the implications for the role of Jews in American society, as I hope to explain. One should begin by considering just what does Bashevis have in mind when he equates what he refers to as the preachers of democracy, the writers, the painters, the clergy, with the communists and the fascists. This ideological slippage reflects a common but uncritical truism of the era, articulated by the writer and critic Randall Jarrell when he wrote, quote, "Most of us know now that Rousseau was wrong, that man, when you knock his chains off, sets up death camps." Irving Howe, responding directly to Jarrell, wrote, quote, "Which chains were knocked off in Germany to permit the setting up of death camps? And which chains must be put up again to prevent a repetition of the death camps?" Stated directly, the 1960s, when Bashevis was writing about the Holocaust in the Cafeteria, and when Jewish writers were beginning to invoke the Holocaust in their urban dystopias, was actually an era of unprecedented prosperity and democratic consensus in American political life. It was also, and this is crucial, an era of unprecedented mass participation in what we can and should recognize today as freedom struggles for civil rights, for feminism, for pacifism, and for the political emancipation of young people. In any of these events, what resonances can be found with the experience of the Holocaust, and what lessons are to be drawn from the parallels that writers such as Bashevis suggest between the recent Jewish past and an American present in which Jews continue to be depicted as outsiders? Some clarity about these questions might be achieved and in turn complicated by juxtaposing Bashevis' story with a contemporaneous work that precedes and may have inspired his story, Edward Louis Wallant's 1961 novel, The Pawnbroker. This novel, immortalized after the author's early death by a 1964 film adaptation directed by Sidney Lumet, portrays a Holocaust survivor working in a pawn shop in Spanish Harlem. American racism, therefore, is juxtaposed explicitly with the pawnbroker's experience in the Nazi death camps, though to what purpose is never completely clear. Narrating from the perspective of the Holocaust survivor, Saul Nazarman, Wallant writes of life in Harlem and of the role of Jewish shopkeepers there, quote, "It was getting confusing. Soon, you wouldn't know the Jews from their oppressors, the black from the white," end quote. One again observes a curious slippage in Wallant's unassailably liberal intentions, dramatized in the disgust that the author Nazarman and we as readers feel toward the racist and conspicuously Jewish police officer Leventhal, whom Wallant places on the beat in the pawn shop's neighborhood. Are the oppressors with whom Jews are becoming indistinguishable white or black? What is more dangerous for Nazarman, the pawnbroker, physically and morally, to be identified with a racist power structure or to be targeted with the people of color whom he both serves and exploits? In Harlem, who is Nazerman supposed to identify as the Nazis, and who the Jews? Wallant returns to this question at the end of his novel, when Nazerman is uncertain if the body odor he smells during the climactic robbery is his or one of his black assailants. Who in this scene is the oppressor and who is the oppressed? Who the Nazi and who the Jew? Who, in turn, would Bashevis identify as the Nazis and the Jews when he equates the preachers of democracy with the fascists? The problem originates in a pervasive effort during the 1960s to understand the civil rights struggle through the lens of the Holocaust. When exploited and oppressed African Americans in places like the neighborhood of Saul Nazerman's pawn shop, within walking distance of Bashevis's dairy cafeteria, resisted the system of brutalization that determined their lives in the U.S., they frequently saw their struggle analogous to the resistance of Jews against the Nazis. Many Jews, particularly Jews still living or working in the inner city, such as the pawnbroker Saul Nazerman, saw the violent excesses of this resistance in anti-Semitic terms that, as Lumet's cinematic adaptation makes more explicit than the novel itself, drew analogies between the black residents of Harlem and the Russian pogroms or the Nazi stormtroopers. James Baldwin characterizes this dilemma in 1967 when he writes, quote, "The Jews' suffering is recognized as part of the moral history of the world's history. This is not true for the blacks. Jewish history is certainly known. The black history has been blasted, maligned, and despised. The Jew is a white man, and when white men rise up against oppression, they are heroes. When black men rise, they have reverted to their native savagery. The uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto was never described as a riot, nor were the participants maligned as hoodlums. The boys and girls in Watts and Harlem are thoroughly aware of this," end quote. Baldwin thus sees the freedom struggle of the 1960s as an unjustly unrecognized analog to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Norman Podhoretz, writing 4 years before Baldwin and partly at Baldwin's own instigation, in his Holocaust-saturated essay, My Negro Problem and Ours, sees the power dynamic between Jews and blacks in diametrically opposite terms. Quote, "How could the Negroes in my neighborhood have regarded the whites across the street and around the corner as jailers? On the whole, the whites were not so poor as the Negroes, but they were quite poor enough, and the years were years of depression. As for white hatred of the Negro, how could guilt have had anything to do with it? What share had these Italian and Jewish immigrants in the enslavement of the Negro? What share had they, downtrodden people themselves, breaking their own necks to eke out a living, in the exploitation of the Negro?" Podhoretz himself leaves these questions unanswered. Now, Bashevis, to be clear, never invokes race explicitly in the Cafeteria or nearly anywhere else in his writing. But the specter of race hangs over his vision of New York City, simultaneously as a foreign country and a replication of the Polish society whose downfall he witnessed up to a point during the 1930s. What is left implicit in Bashevis's description of New York City becomes explicit and explicitly racist in Saul Bellow's description of Manhattan in the same moment through the eyes of his survivor protagonist, Arthur Zamler. The means by which Bashevis or Bellow established these problematic equations between contemporary New York and Europe during the Holocaust, the temporal dysfunction that Bashevis describes as the symptoms of a mind gone berserk, is a familiar yet outrageous dependence on tropes of madness and mental illness to depict or convey the Holocaust. For Bashevis, the past assaults the present, undermining the logic of both. It is another instance of the return of the repressed that erupts everywhere in the social landscape of post-war New York City. And this return signifies repression, both in the Freudian sense, but also the political one referenced in Randall Jarrell's poorly conceived understanding of freedom in relationship to the death camps. The past in the Cafeteria doesn't merely reappear to Esther. It robs her psychically and emotionally. One notes that this convention, as seen both in the Cafeteria and the Pawnbroker, nearly always draws on formulas deployed by authors who did not personally experience the Holocaust, Bashevis himself very much included. One doesn't encounter tropes of madness in the survivor memoirs of Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, David Weiss-Halivni, or Charlotte Delbo. Even the magical realism of Avram Sutzkever's prose poetry never requires the reader to play psychoanalyst or diagnostician to his narrators or his characters. Bashevis's Holocaust protagonists, like Esther in the Cafeteria, are always observed externally, hence the distinction between survivors and refugees, because the Holocaust itself cannot be imagined, because it exists outside the refugee's comprehension or experience. The experience of the survivor must be depicted de facto as a form of madness, an aberration as acute as the insanity of the genocide itself. Madness, moreover, serves a specifically political doubled function. It is a polemical device to critique the madness of contemporary New York, but it's also a dramatic correlative to the problem of imagining the Holocaust itself. Madness, as such, is a frequent theme in the Holocaust literature written by non-survivors, because the reality of the Holocaust defies rational thinking, and therefore, to begin contemplating the subject requires a suspension of everyday logic that can only be achieved in realistic fiction through the insane protagonist. The mad protagonist in the fiction of Walland, Bashevis, and their followers counts both as an effort to rationalize the irrational and to absolve the author from the consequences of his or her character's choices. Yet this perspective results in leaving Bashevis as estranged from his damaged protagonist as he is from the United States. Despite the affecting writing of stories like Die Cafeteria, the author continues to consign himself and his language, now a stylistically impoverished American Yiddish, deprived of his habitually expressive recourse to Kabbalistic and Midrashic references, to a half-life of the living dead. New York City is not in actual terms comparable to Poland of the 1940s, except for someone such as Bashevis, who confines himself to an experience arrested by the traumas of his own immigration at a moment of catastrophe and crisis, a neurotic discourse of repetition and projection conspicuously absent among contemporary Yiddish writers such as Kadia Molodowski, Bluma Lempel, or Avram Sutzkever. The paradox that works such as the Cafeteria and the Pawnbroker expose is the double bind implicit in the way that the Holocaust has been depicted as a unique example of collective martyrdom. At one and the same time, the Holocaust has been used to insinuate that other instances of collective suffering fail to measure up to the extremity of the Holocaust and therefore may not be compared with it. And the only purpose, therefore, for which the Holocaust may be appropriately mobilized is to illustrate how incomparable an experience it was. The shadow cast by the Holocaust, nonetheless, becomes so pervasive in its influence on post-war life that even everyday life on the Upper West Side of Manhattan becomes an extension of Nazism and genocide. This contradiction is a consequence of the way that the Holocaust has been envisioned, not by survivors, but by writers such as Bashevis or Walland, who never actually experienced its actual depredations. It is a consequence of the instrumentalization of the Holocaust as a means of reproach or vicarious aggrandizement. We see these consequences all the more acutely and recklessly today, when Vladimir Putin presumes to denazify the only one of Russia's former colonies with a Jewish president. What obligates us now to read writers such as Bashevis critically, not in spite, but because of the seductiveness and dramatic resonance of his writing, is the habit of far less nuanced storytellers, of equating present political realities, requiring their own interpretation and response with the genocide of Jews nearly 80 years ago. the callous equation of democracy with totalitarianism in Bashevis's writing serves to alert us to more insidious equations in which the purpose of the equation is not merely to critique the good, but to advance the evil. The only just reading of Bashevis's best stories, and to be clear, I certainly consider Die Cafeteria among his very best, must not end with an interpretation of his character's irrationality, but of the author's own counterfactual claims as well. Thank you.